Hello friends, I'm David Vos. Hope you're all having a great day. It is a beautiful, beautiful day in Texas, and I'm having a great day. The weather is getting hot. I like going out in the evenings and walking. Last night there was a little storm off in the distance, and it kind of sprinkled, kind of just missed us, but sprinkled a little bit, and there was lightning, and those are the evenings that I love, these summer nights. I think it was, wasn't it Glenn Campbell, one of my favorite singers, who sang the song, Summer Nights, you know. Oh, those were the days. But those days are gone, and we're now going into different times. There's things going on. Things are beginning to sort of make themselves known. I mean, 20 years ago, we didn't have access to a lot of information that we have today. I guarantee it. People believed certain things just completely, and they had no idea that there was any other information available. We've been digging up the Sumerian tablets for a long time, but it's really been recently that this information is getting out there, that we're becoming aware of this. A lot of Christians, most Christians, are not aware of the available information. If we could all sit down and hear all of the available information, there wouldn't be any arguments. We'd all understand. Because knowledge doesn't lie. Facts don't lie. The problem is there's a lot of deceivers that have gone forth, according to the Bible, according to the New Testament. There are deceivers. And, you know, it's pretty easy to deceive people when you control the media, the religions, the propaganda. What we want to do is find out, not just speculation. You know, you can read a lot of stuff on the internet. You can read it's speculation. There's lots of people with theories. Some people have some stories. Some people claim to have translations that are more accurate, or more information based on some theory that they have. And so it does become a little vague at times, because if you do any research into the past, you may discover that there's a little confusion. I don't think it's really because the information is confusing, but you've got to separate the facts and the information and the history from people who interpret that history. And you have to understand that people interpret history based on what they were taught when they were little. We humans have been taught ethically and morally to stand by what our mother and father told us. It's like our moms and dads taught us a bunch of stuff. They never proved it to us. Despite what you were told, it wasn't ever proven. Or they might have thrown a book at you and said, here's the Bible. All right, now we believe in that book. And if you don't believe in that book, you're of the devil. Don't research anything that we've told you. It's not a matter of we're going to go to school and learn some things and dig up some archaeology and find out the facts and go back and read all the ancient history. No, we're not going to do any of that. We're just going to believe in this book. Well, what is this book? Well, it's an ancient book, and it was given to us by the prophets. Well, it's actually a lot of books that are compiled. And the one who compiled all of those books happens to be an individual that declares himself God, the Vicar of Christ. He's the one that made all those paper bulls and edicts, created the Inquisition and the Illuminati in 1776, and with the Jesuit priests who were the inquisitors who went out and murdered you because you didn't agree with their teachings. And if you had a Bible book, that just means a canon of books that they collected at that time. And if you didn't, you know, first off, they didn't want you reading any of the ancient scriptures. That's why they burned the Alexandrian library. Now I'm going to show you in probably this video, and as I've done in many videos, that the Alexandrian library It's not like it was we're thinking of library like today. Every town has a library, and you go in and you see all kinds of authors and books, and people are milling around. Others are writing best-selling novels and so forth. It wasn't full of novels. This library in those days meant all of the accumulated information and knowledge and history of mankind. Okay, so you say, oh, well, that was all burned. It's been lost. Guess what? We dug it up again. Every great nation had a big library or a place where this history was inscribed. In early days, it was actually the priests who inscribed this information precisely because it was ancient history, and human beings only live a short period of time, so we don't know that history. So the scribes were actually taking down notes that was given to them by the gods. And what we're going to find out is the gods were on the earth in those days, and they were men from other planets, and they had technology. And then there were gods later on that came along who didn't want us to have that history. So they burned these libraries down. And, by divine right, by divine destiny, all of that information has not been lost. But it was lost for a long period of time. There is no doubt, there's no reasonable doubt, friends, that the Bible that we have is edited. And I don't mean just a little, grammarization, so forth. There were alterations, there are omissions, and yes, in the very Torah, the Bible itself says in Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 8, that the scribes are liars. It says, you think you have Torah? You have the lying pen of the scribes. But you see, some have taken that verse to say, well, it's an anomaly, it's not what it really means, it's poetic or something or other. Maybe it's an accusation that's not true. But if you read through the Old Testament, you'll find that this God Jehovah sent lying spirits to the earth. It says this very thing throughout the Bible. Samuel, and also in Kings and Chronicles, it talks about Jehovah sending lying spirits. In several places it calls Jehovah Satan, because he would send lying, evil demons down upon the earth to deceive mankind. So there was a lot of lying going on with one particular God who seems to be a God in rebellion. Oh, friends, this gets convoluted. Our history has been hidden from us. And it's frightening and it's shocking. And I don't want to shock anybody, but we have to know the truth. So the Bible was edited, restructured, and there were lots of things that were removed from the Bible. Also at the Council of Nicaea. The earliest of the Jewish scriptures, or the Hebrew writings, were written between the 6th century BC and the 1st centuries BC. 600 BC and up to the days of Christ. So they're not that old. It's been 2,000 years since Jesus, since the story of Christ. And so before Christ, about 600 years, because the Jewish people were taken into Babylonian captivity about 600 BC. And then they came back to the land. So everything before the destruction of Jerusalem, we have no records. There are no Jewish records in extent. There are books that were salvaged from individuals after 600 BC who were called prophets, who were given the word of the Lord, and there were written prophecies and things. But the history, or the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, which is the history from Adam to the flood to the Sodom and Gomorrah, all of that history is parallel to all of the other ancient histories in all of Babylon, Egypt, Assyria, Acadia, the Canaanites, the Philistines. All the nations of the earth had the exact same biblical history. And if you read all of it, the basic things are always there. The Bible is a very small version of it. There are literally thousands of tablets that were dug up in summer. There are Babylonian tablets, there are Akkadian tablets, there are Egyptian writings, there are many, many writings, and all of them tell the same story. Even in Maya, in Peru, or the Aztecs, they all tell the same story about these particular gods. We find out that the Elohim of the Bible is definitely a plural word, and we find out that Yahweh is not the actual earliest spelling of that name. The Bible itself says when Moses met this God that his name would be Iyah. He says in the Hebrew, "What is your name?" And the Lord of the Jews said, "My name is Iyah, Asher, Iyah." The word Asher in between the Iyahs simply is a what or who. So when he says Iyah, Asher, Iyah, he's saying my name is Iyah. Who am I? Iyah. And for a long time we've understood Iyah, Asher, Iyah. It's written in some translations just like that. We've understood that to mean that somehow God's name was Iyah, Asher, Iyah. Like we just combine all those syllables. No. That's a sentence. He's not saying my name is Iyah, Asher, Iyah. He's saying my name is Iyah. I am Iyah. So that was the original spelling. But remember, words have tenses. Now in English, we don't have that. In English, we use the tense of a verb or the tense of a word differently. We don't spell it out at the ending of the word in the way that they did in, say, Greek or Latin or the Sumerian. So, so in Greek, when you have the word Jesus, which was written originally Ies, you also have the tense of that word written at the end. So it's Iesus, or Iesun, or Iesu. So the one tense of that name, Iesus, has stuck, and we say Iesus, or Jesus, using the English-sized J. But his name wasn't Iesus. His name was Ies. The last three letters is simply the tense of that name. The same goes for the name Paul. Paul's name in English is Paul, but sometimes we say Apollos, or Apollo, or Apollyon. Now in the book of Revelation, it gives his name as Apollyon. But elsewhere it uses the name Apollos, or sometimes just Paul, because the last three letters are just the tense of the word. So, Iyah is the original name of this particular God. Even in the Hebrew writings in our own Bible, it sometimes calls him Iyah Enki. They just don't translate the Enki or transliterate it into Enki. They just translate it into some kind of English for us. So you don't know that the Bible was literally talking about Iyah Enki. And we also don't understand it because in those days, words or titles of people or gods or kings, you weren't actually, most of the time you're not given their name. You're given a title. Enki. The an at the beginning of a word is sometimes part of the title. It goes back to the god or the son of that particular god. Even this went on in Babylon when you got the czar at the end, Belteshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar. The word czar there means they are the king. And that's come down to us as the Caesars, the czars of Russia, or the Khazars. So words come down to us and then they lose their meaning and we begin to misunderstand. But there's no question that Elohim in the Bible is a plurality, and there were many gods who created the world. And one particular god was known as Iyah Enki. And that is the God that today we say Jehovah, which is really a very mistranslated word that goes back to the original simple form Iyah. So the editings in the Bible are really rewritings of this information. And not only that, but omissions. When they would go to another reign of time and they would want to retranslate for that particular day, they would leave things out that was not convenient for that particular day and age. For instance, we don't have in our Old Testament the book of Jubilees or the book of Enoch, even though those books are written about in our Bibles. And so the Bible in the book of Joshua and the book of Samuel talks about the book of Jasher, but it's nowhere in our Bible. There are other books. There is a book mentioned in the book of Numbers called the Book of the Wars of Jehovah, or the Book of the Wars of Ea. And there is another book in Isaiah chapter 34, I think verse 16 or somewhere in there, that mentions the Book of the Lord, or the Book of Ea. See, this is probably the book that we dug up over there in Samaria, which is their source book. This is why Deuteronomy and Isaiah is mentioning the books of Enki, or Ea Enki, because that is their source information. And so then you begin to understand the Bible a little bit more clear, and you find out that when the Bible says the Most High of the gods, that now makes sense. There are many gods, but there is one God they considered the Most High. And in Hebrew, it is written the El Elyon. So Elohim, then, is definitely plural. And it is, like in Psalms 82, verse 2, the El Elyon, who is the deity or the ruler, and sits in the divine assembly, or the Elohim, which is plural. Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 8 through 9, especially in the Septuagint version, makes it very clear that the Most High God divided up the world into 70 sections. And we find later on that that basically is just a rounding off of the number 72. So the gods were 72, and just like the wheel of astrology that's broken into 12 sections, and then there are 3 deacons to each section. 12 and 12 is 24, and then another time around would be 36. Of course, there's not 12 hours in a day, there's 24 hours in every day. So there are 3 deacons in each of the hours. 3 times 24 is 72. So this is how many gods there were in the astrological wheel. These are the gods that rule the world. There were 72. And so there in the book of Revelation, there are 24 elders around God's throne, because you see, that is God's throne. These gods are the Elohim, and they all worship, and it is the El Elyon who sits in the divine assembly of the gods. It is the great round table, the same round table that Jesus sat at with his disciples. He was that God there in that picture. Jesus proclaims himself in the great Last Supper as the God that all of the other Elohim will bow and listen to and adore. And so that is the same God as King Arthur at the round table, and so on and so on. It is in all the stories of every religion of all of the nations throughout all of time. Just because they use different names does not make them different gods. But as we're going to see, many of the names are really just the same names, slightly changed because of the particular language. So this is how it goes. So it all has to do with the rotations of the astrological wheel. And all of these particular gods had their months when they ruled, or their astrological ages that they ruled. And so it has a lot to do with the esoteric wisdom and religion and time. So as time went on, the calendar would change and the names of the gods would fluctuate a little bit because of the prevailing nation and their languages, but it was always the same gods that were spoken. So Jehovah then is not really the name of any god. That's something that has just come down to us in error. We even got religions that are running around saying they worship Jehovah. And somehow that makes them the true religion, when in reality it just makes them fools, because they don't understand that the Bible that they have is thousands of years old and was an excerpt from many other writings amongst many other nations. And they don't understand the genealogy of that name and how it's come down to us. So originally, as we said, it is Ea, Asher, Ea. But in that particular place, it explains that he was known by the name of El Shaddai. That was his name originally. Well, El Shaddai, we translate to God Almighty. El being God and Shaddai being almighty or powerful. And others have translated that as a lofty mountain. I think there's a lot of words that some are saying means this and some are saying means that, because they too are being deceived because they don't speak that language. But a mountain is already lofty, and so when the ancient ones spoke of mountains, they sometimes gave it the name of the lofty. All right, so whenever you say the lofty or the high or the exalted, you don't always mean a mountain. And so the root of the word Elyon, the word yon is high. However, they do indeed refer to a bearded man on a mountain, because that was the symbolism that even our own Bible gives us, with Jehovah standing on his mountain and with thunderbolts coming down and thick gloom and darkness. Okay? So we're not certain the exact translation of these particular titles, but that was his original title. And so Most High and Lofty Mountain, or God of the High Mountain, may actually be both correct. More confusing is the fact that today we use the term God or Lord. And originally, Lord in different languages was sometimes considered the name of a god. For instance, Adonai, throughout our Bible, is translated Lord, and so is Baal. And yet they are two distinct different gods. Both of them lords. And then you'll find that even An in the Sumerian tongue sometimes means Lord, according to the translators. Well, here's what we're learning from this, friends. The scholars don't know what they're talking about, because this is all recent. We're digging all of this up. And so we were translating it for hundreds of years, maybe 1,000 years, saying, oh, look at this, Baal means Lord. Oh, look at this, Adonai must mean Lord. And when it says that the God of the Jews, or one of their gods, is Adonai, that just must mean another name for Jehovah. See, that just means Lord, right? No, Adonai is a different God. And if you go back to the Egyptian tongue and the Greeks, Adon or Adoni, that was a Greek god that went back to the Egyptian pantheon. So it is not just a name that means Lord. And they're fooling you. And so therefore the Sumerians, sometimes you'll read where it says An Ki just means Lord of Earth, because Ki, they know, means earth. And they say, well, An just means Lord. No, An doesn't mean Lord. All of these words don't all mean Lord. They are all lords, yes, all of them. And they're all gods, or at least that's the English word, but they are particular gods. The word Elohim is plural. And the word, basically, El means power. So these are the powerful ones. And so Adonai in our Bible is not the same word as Yahweh, or does it mean Lord? So to understand who these two beings are, we have to look to where these gods were operating. In the old Canaanite text, which we have discovered in about the 1920s, it tells us that their courts were in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley in Mesopotamia, where the Sumerian Eden Delta, there in the Persian Gulf, existed. And you can trace out the ancient Sumerian records. And there we discover these two particular gods. In summer, the storm god eventually became known as Enlil, or Ulu-Kur-Gal. And that meant the ruler of the mountain. And his brother was Adon. Who'd have thunk? Well, sometimes he was called Enki. Adonai was also called Enki, exactly as our Bible says. Iya, okay, is the original spelling, not Yahweh, but Yahweh is just adding the tense on the end of the word. But the root of the word is Iya, and they called him Iya, Enki, and they also called him Adonai. To the Canaanites, these gods were sometimes called Baal, and Baal means owner. It doesn't mean Lord, as so many people try to say. Because, in fact, when a man married a woman, he was the Baal of his wife, meaning he was the owner. And so, many of these words are not what they appear, and you're going to find lots of people saying they're one thing when they're really another. And this is what makes studying the ancient scriptures so difficult, because there's lies built into lies. So, In different ages, they were known as different things. El Shaddai, Adonai, Ariman, and Mazda. And today, God the Father and His Son, Jesus Christ, and the God of this world, Satan the devil. This particular God that's in our Bible, we know is not our supreme Father, the one who rules over all things, and that the Sumerians called the All-Father, or the Father of all beginnings. And that particular God was much greater than the Nibirians, even though the Anunnaki, or the Sumerian gods, were considered to be gods there in Babylon, and we're going to find out why. I mean, they literally tried to get people to worship them. They built temples, and they ruled over them and made laws of slavery. This is the same thing that this particular god, Ea, did with the Jews, or Enki Ea. And it's described all the way through the Sumerian tablets, the Babylonian tablets, the Akkadian tablets, the Egyptian writings. And so this particular god would cause great floods upon the earth, and tempests and famines. He would destroy and maim and pillage, and he would command destruction, and he demanded worship. Sometimes Enki was considered the god, the trickster god, or the fool that's in the deck of cards that we have today. For those who are trained in the esoteric wisdom, there really isn't any confusion. But it's vast, all of this knowledge and all of these books. And for the average person to go back and read the Greek mythologies and the Egyptian writings and all of the kings that go back through the pharaohs, we don't even know who the pharaohs are. How are we going to know their history? The average Christian thinks that the pharaohs were the evil, satanic line of Satan or something, when in fact the pharaohs, that word pharaoh, they weren't even called pharaohs. That's just another title. But if you go back in the pharaoh chronology, written by Manetho, and written on the tombs and the sarcophagus, you'll find all of the names of the Jewish patriarchs, all the way back to Abraham, written in their king lines. The pharaohs were Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the Bible talks about how Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and his sons and his wives were all buried there at the Great Pyramid. Now, we don't have time to get into that, but I've talked about that in other videos. But there is so much we do not know. The pharaohs go back all the way to Joseph, went down into Egypt, and to his father Abraham, who created that land, who went out from his father's people in Ur to the land, or the Nile River, and there El Elyon, the Most High, promised. You see, the Apostle Paul says that the law that came 430 years later, given by this Ea, does not make void the promise given to us by our Father. The New Testament is very clear that we worship the Father of the gods and not these other gods, or this law that was given by the hand of an angel who fell, as Acts chapter 7 says, who made them set up a tent in the wilderness, and they drug the tent around. And there the Apostle Paul calls them, well, Luke, who was writing that particular history for the Apostle Paul, writes there and says that that god Ea was also known as the god Molech, and that they were worshiping their star, which we see as the Star of David today. And this is also in the book of Colossians, where it says that Jesus nailed that law to the cross and defeated their God in hell. And it says that the religion of the Jews in Colossians chapter 2 was the worship of angels. And Galatians chapter 2 and 3 also mentions that this entire law was given by the administration of an angel that we call Ea. And that was a fallen angel. So this God did a lot of brutal things and commanded brutal, terrible wars and destruction and the killing of babies and the raping of women. Many times he's called the God of wrath. And it developed into a religion which was basically in fear of this God. In fact, to this day, we call it the fear of God. But this is not the same thing that the New Testament is talking about, because it talks about something different, which was never mentioned in the Old Testament, but it's the love of God. And how we love because he first loved us, and because there is no condemnation in us who follow after the Spirit. So it was Ea Enki who created the garden, and who created the Sabbath, and who created slavery, and who in the Sumerian tablets is said to be the one who holds the May, which is the ancient laws. And it was those laws that he wrote down on Mount Sinai, but they're written in codified form as we have them. That is not the actual writing of those laws, but they are based upon those laws. It tells us throughout the Sumerian tablets that Enlil, which again is just a title, it means An-El, Enlil. An-El. El is God or power, and An is heaven. So it's the God of heaven, or you should say it is by the commands of the Elohim, or the gods, or from the gods in heaven, that the God on earth, An-Ki, the God of earth, would disseminate the laws. Now, the Sumerian tablets are more in-depth explaining how these laws came down, how An-Ki or Ea would argue with the Elohim. There were councils in the heavens, and they had big disagreements. This is even in the Bible, as we said in Psalms 82:2, where El Elyon is reigning in the divine assembly, and they have these disputes. You read about it in the book of Job, where Satan walked into the council and asked the God Most High whether or not he was allowed or could be allowed to torture individuals on earth and cause there to be destructions and pestilences. Obviously, the book of Job is a very symbolic, poetic version of many more ancient versions of all of this destruction and death. And we're going to find out in this series that we're doing that the earth has gone through the flood and the evil wind, which appears to be a nuclear holocaust on earth after the flood sometime. There have been these things. Our Bible mentions instituted by angry gods fighting and warring amongst themselves. And most of the stuff that is perpetrated upon mankind, you'll find out in other writings, had more to do with the arguing and the fighting of the gods themselves. And maybe that's why in the book of Revelation it says that there is a war in heaven. It's really a spiritual war, and we're battling this spiritual war today. The apostles tell us the truth about all of this, that when human beings can regain their rightful place as the heirs of our Father in heaven, then all of these wars will cease. That they are really, even according to Anu, he writes that they, the gods, are really only the messengers to us. And the Bible itself says the angels desire to peer into this because we are the children of the living God. And they will not inherit salvation apart from us, and we will rule over them, and we shall judge the angels. This is in the New Testament, friends. You have no idea who you are. You human beings have no idea who you are. You read about the gods, you read about the Old Testament and this strange, awful, wrathful, vengeful God who says, I am God and I am a God of vengeance and I will not pardon you of your sins, and to the third and the fourth generation I shall punish you. And you don't even know that you literally have the right to defeat him because you have more authority and power with our Father in heaven than he does. But you only must speak the word. This is why when Jesus came to the earth, he had no fear of these particular gods. And he stood there and he said, you can even take my life. He did that so that you and I would know that they cannot take our life. Not indeed, not in reality. But we have the authority. That's why Jesus said, my kingdom's no part of this world. Huh. You see that coin? Whose inscription is upon that coin? Well, it's Caesar's. He says, okay, then pay Caesar's things to Caesar, but pay God's things to God. And he was talking about his Father in heaven. And he says that the Jewish God, their father, was the devil, and he was a liar and a murderer from the beginning, from beneath. But his Father was from above, the light, the love, the God of love. And he had no wrath in him, and there was no darkness in him. He says, you've never seen my Father, you've never heard his voice. Even though you heard the voice of your God upon that mountain as he quaked and thundered, and all the people went running in panic and saying, please don't let him speak to us, but you speak to us. And they created the priesthood to rule over mankind, dictating the will of that angry God, making you all slaves. But according to our Lord Jesus, we were deceived, and he is the deceiver. And not only that, he is the slanderer, because all of his accusations, the accuser, they are slander, and you are not bound by him. but through your word, whatever you say shall be done. And if you say unto that mountain to be removed and thrown into the sea, will obey you. And if you tell that mulberry tree or that fig tree to be uprooted, it also will wither up and die at your command. So what we're dealing with when we're dealing with the Torah is we're dealing with ancient excerpts from a long, long story of these particular gods that are ruling upon earth that are not gods at all. So the Sumerian version has the Tower of Babel. There's a version of that, the version of the flood, the version of everything else. And it is Enki who confounds the languages at the Tower of Babel in the Sumerian tablets. He's shown to be jealous for Anu and Shamash because they were getting more worship than he was. And it is Enki who sends demons on the people in anger, which reminds us of the Jewish scriptures where Jehovah sends the evil spirit on King Saul. And he sends evil spirits to the prophets, lying spirits, so that the world or the people will know only lies. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Enki is the one who's created the demon spirits. And it is Enki who rules over the Absu, or as in our Bible, the abyss, or the waters. And in the abyss there are mermaids and evil spirits and demons. And all of these evil spirits are the dominion of Enki. And even many of the theological debaters and apologists will begin to recognize that the biblical scriptures, the tales of creation, the story of Adam and Eve, the Garden of Eden, the deluge, the Tower of Babel, all of this was written down thousands of years before this. And all of this came from the writings of the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. Now we've been digging these books up probably for about almost 200 years, and we've been slowly translating these ancient texts, basically uncovering what was lost when they burned the Alexandrian library and destroyed the library at Constantinople and other libraries around the world. And now we're digging them up, and it reveals the existence of lost texts that we don't even know. Most people today have no idea that these texts exist. And if you could find these texts and read them and make sense of them and realize that they fit exactly the knowledge that we have, that there's no escaping the fact that these texts are actual ancient history. And I'm going to prove that in this video. And I'm sure we're going to do several videos in the series, friends. But they're called lost books even then. Not just today are they lost, but they have been lost, many of them, even in the days of the books that we call lost. In those days, sometimes they mention earlier books, because we're talking about the history of mankind for a million years, at least for about 435,000 years specifically, when these records began to be kept very, very well on this earth. Of course, we have some records that talk about history on the planet Nibiru, which could go back even a million years. And in those texts, they have reference of a royal library or religious royal libraries that did at one time existed on the earth. The Epic of Gilgamesh reveals the secrets of the gods. There it talks about the mutiny of a bunch of gods called the Igi, and because of that, they end up creating Adam, or human beings, or aka their slaves. And we then became the dirty, good-for-nothing slaves of the gods on Nibiru. The era Epos unveils the big calamity. It talks about a thing called the big calamity when Nergal destroyed the entire Mesopotamia with 7 evil winds. That is written in the Book of Thoth, which is supposed to be sealed, and it's supposed to be somewhere in the subterranean chamber, which I have said in other videos is a very symbolic way of talking about the fact that it is the book of the world, and Thoth is the mind, and all of the ancient history is written in the stars, and it's called astrology. But the existence of these lost books, some of which are the basis for all the other books, like I say, which is astrology, which is the stars, And there are books which explain or interpret the stars, written in ancient times, which were the sacred books. And the Bible, then, is inspired of God, indubitably, but it is inspired by accounts of the gods written by prophets. And so, therefore, it is more parabolic at times than it is historical. But it is like mythology, like parables, like stories that tell the truth if you know the meaning of the hieroglyph, if you know the meaning of the code. But that is it, friends. The Bible is true only so far as you can interpret it correctly. And that is how the Apostle Paul describes it, my friends. If you believe in the Bible itself, then you must believe in all of the Bible. And, of course, the Apostle Paul says that the law, in the form of its literal sense, is a curse and is wrong and is false, and we should not go by it. But he says that the law is good and the law is holy and it is spiritual, my friends. And if you do not know that the law or the Torah or our Bible is spiritual and that it is written decades and centuries beyond the time that the original manuscripts and the original history was written, if you do not know that, if you're going to take that as actual truth and history, you're mistaken. There wasn't an actual serpent in the garden speaking to Adam and Eve. That is a symbol. And if you cannot comprehend that, you will remain in darkness. We know that Ptolemy II, this is around the year 270, gave to the Egyptian priest called Manetho, the Greeks called him Manetho, they made him to compile a history of all of the history of Egypt. And he says this. Now mark this very carefully. This is a historian. This is not scripture. Some of you will take the historians as more accurate than the ancient scriptures. But I only put them together to show that they corroborate each other. The great historians were commissioned by the same people that commissioned the prophets anyway. But here's what Manetho said. He said, at that time only reigned the gods. Then came the mid-gods, and finally, towards about 3100, began the dynasty of the pharaohs. The divine reigns, he writes, began 10,000 years before the flood and continued thousands of years later. The last period having been the witness of battles and wars between the gods. Now also, in the days of Babylon, way back further than this, there was a Babylonian priest called Berosus, and he writes in the history of the gods and men, there are 3 volumes, he writes about a time 432,000 years before the flood, before the deluge, when the gods came onto the earth. Berosus lists by name the duration of the reign of the first 10 commanders-in-chief. He reports that the very first leader was dressed as a fish. He lands on the sea. We know that's around the Persian Gulf area. He was the one who brought the civilization to humankind. The name given by that ancient Greek to this being was Oannes. And now, friends, think about it. Oannes is the same as John or Joannes. And so his name was John. And in fact, Oannes is the same as the city of On in Egypt, as we say it today, but it's really the city of An. And An or Anu is the heaven, the high God. And of course the Greeks called it Oranos, with the adding of or, which is the word light, onto Anus or Anos. And so Oannes was the particular god who originally came to the earth wearing a fish hat. And so the story and the history of the gods came, and the stories of Ea and Enki, the prince of the earth. Berosus writes in his 3 volumes that before the flood, the gods tried to protect stone tablets which were buried on the site of Sippar, one of the ancient cities where they were established. Sippar, as many other cities of Mesopotamia, was submerged by the devastating waters of the flood, and the tablets were considered lost. Berosus writes in his 3 volumes about scriptures and histories that were lost even in their day. He says that there was a city called Sippar, which was an ancient city that the gods had established in the very beginning, and it had been submerged under the flood waters. And also, when that city was flooded and destroyed, the tablets that it had, that they wrote, were also lost. And it mentions that under the reign of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, which is about 668 BC, that they made references to these lost tablets, and they appear in the annals of the monarch. And so in the middle of the 19th century, archaeologists discovered this, the ruins of this place called Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, and they discovered 2,500 clay tablets. And so we actually then, at that time, discovered this great library that was spoken of by Berosus 1,000 years before. In one of these tablets, we read the confidences of Ashurbanipal, the god of scribes, which is Thoth, rewarded me by offering me the knowledge of art, and I was initiated into the secret of writings. I can read complicated Sumerian tablets. I understand the secret words engraved on the stone the previous days before the flood. And so on those books that we have dug up, in those tablets, it also speaks of lost books. Friends, this world has been around for hundreds of thousands of years, and the histories keep coming down to us in the form of tablets, clay tablets, history. This is why they had to put it down in symbols. By the time we get it in our Bible, it's been handed down and the stories have been altered slightly, and now we're talking about 12 tribes of Israel. Only about 3,000 years ago, when in reality the 12 sons of the gods goes back to a time of thousands and thousands of years ago. And so the stories are being adapted in our Bible. And even in the story of Jesus, he chooses 12 disciples to sort of dramatize this ancient story. We've got to understand all of this. We can't just pretend we already know everything. And so it talks about in those tablets that they dug up recently, it talks about a list of Sumerian kings. It tells about one of the leaders whose name was Ea. It says he experienced a great disappointment in his mission when he came to the earth because of his half-brother Enlil. And you see, he was relegated far away from the cities of God. It says that they put him in a very faraway place, basically, which was a spaceport, and it was situated in this place called Eden, or our biblical Eden. Ea became prince of the earth, or god of the earth, and he was basically supervising the extraction of the gold in the mines of the Abzu, which they say is down around Africa. It's also the word that means the land beneath. And so in astrological charts, you've got the circle and everything on the bottom of the wheel is the Abzu. And so that is the place where this particular god, Enki, is always depicted as a fish or a goat. And so sometimes a fish goat. The top part of him is a goat and the bottom part is a fish, because he's going through these thousands of years like a fish with a like a fish swimming through the abyss or the Abzu. But his front part being like a goat to climb up through, when you get to the apex of the bottom of the wheel and you start climbing to get to the top of the mountain. And this is why one of the reasons he's depicted as a fish goat, because fish starts the cycle of rebirth in the bottom of the ocean where things begin to evolve and move upwards. But it also betrays the real history of our world, and is talking about a particular person that we now call Ea, who very clearly in our Bible makes great commandments and judgments upon the world. And in the Sumerian tablets, he's called a great scientist. When he arrived here, he was a very intelligent man. This is why we were created, because this particular God created the physical bodies. Our spirits do not belong to him or to this world. We're no part of this world. Our Father, the Father of our spirits, is in heaven. But while we're in this world, we are subject to the god of this world, and he blinds the minds of the unbeliever. And so it is that this God was here on earth extracting the gold in the mines. He was very carefully paying attention to the environment on this world. So if you read through the tablets of Enki, there are 14 tablets, you'll see that when they arrived here, they began to notice monkeys. They saw monkeys. They described these monkeys who walked upright. And some gorillas and apes walk upright. And aside from the monkeys, it speaks very clearly of the fact that there were humanoids on the earth before the Anunnaki arrived here. That these humanoids are actually the rightful owners of this planet. And they stood upright. They did not have the technology that the Sumerians had, but they were individuals that lived on this world and had evolved on this world. The Sumerian tablets speak about the evolution of NIBIRU for millions of years. They teach very clearly that everything in nature evolves from the sea. Just as 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 40, right in that area of that chapter of 15, talks about the evolution of man from the fish, then the birds, then to the mammals, and then to men. And then later, in the resurrection to eternal life, we'll progress and move from the moon to the glory of the sun to the glory of the stars, and each star differs in star and glory. This is speaking about the transmigration of the soul. We are no part of this world, but on this world, the God of this world, the God of vengeance, the God who says I am and there is none else, and if you don't obey me, I will destroy you, is the God who was set upon the earth, Enki, or the God of earth, who took his orders from the Elohim, or the Enlil. And so the Sumerian tablets talk about their spaceships and their spaceports on earth, and they situated these in a place called Eden. And Enki became the prince of the earth, and he supervised all of this particular gold extraction because they had to take it back to their home planet Nibiru because the atmosphere was beginning to leak out. Their summers were getting very hot and they couldn't take the heat, and they were basically dying. So in order to mine the gold, they sent some Anunnaki here. They made a spaceport on Mars and they made one on the moon. And one of the gods who had rebelled ended up going to Mars and died there. But there were individuals that were on Mars that rebelled. These Iggy, these particular workers or Anunnakis that were mining the gold, they began to feel that the work was too much and they were tired and they wanted to quit and they couldn't go on. Well, they couldn't just stop the work because